Anyway, I studied for the ministry a long, long time ago. And at the time, it was fairly clear that there were things in common between Roman Catholics and Episcopalians and Lutherans. And we used to joke about it some. We figured that the Roman Catholics were, involved in their ritual and their kneeling and in those days a Latin Mass. And so we used to make some comments about that, and then we thought Episcopalians were those who were not quite ready to kneel and learn Latin in ways that Catholics might, so it was a little easier. And then Lutherans were not inclined to kneel, or am I doing this right? Or
I was thinking
okay.
And then I wanted to straighten that out because I want you to look good.
How's my hair?
Wait a minute, he's looking for a comb.
Okay.
She's teasing.
I believe in the pursuit of happiness. Anyway, but we thought about the differences, and one thing I really noted is Lutherans don't talk about saints in the same way that either Episcopalians or Roman Catholics might do. In fact, if you look at Lutheran hymnals in the 20th century, maybe only one or two people from the 20th century are even mentioned there, like Dog Hammarskjöld definitely was, and Martin Luther King, but a few others. But there's something that we share, and that is understanding is a saint is someone who especially has God's Spirit working in and through them to bring about good and wonderful things on this earth. And this week, I happen to remember for me, what was the strongest personal saint I ever knew. His name was Andrew Schultze. He was a Lutheran pastor. But before I tell you a little about him, I want to digress a bit. And that is, I don't know how your education was, but when it came to matters of race, the general thing I learned in a bunch of California schools I went to was that it was a Southern problem. It still sort of was, but it was being worked out. And the North nobly fought a civil war in order to solve this problem. And all this about Abraham Lincoln and this and that. And okay, that sounded fine, but we didn't learn about the racism in California. We didn't learn about the racism in Oregon. And if you are still, I'm glad Father Bernie's been willing to talk about this, but recently on PBS in Oregon, there's a program called Oregon Experience, and it has a whole thing about the Ku Klux Klan in Oregon. Remember the history here with all the timber stuff is a lot of people were coming from the South. Georgia Pacific, Louisiana Pacific, and they were here creating a lot of the same type of racism as in the Deep South. But racism was not only in the Deep South, and this week something really reminded me of how much we have to go in the future. And what reminded me is you probably have heard a national monument is being created in Springfield, Illinois, because in 1908 there was a terrible race riot there in the land that we thought, wow, this is the land of Lincoln. This is where he practiced law. This was where he evolved as a person. And yet, 50 years after the Civil War, there was a terrible, terrible thing there. And now let me get back to that saint I was mentioning. He was a Lutheran pastor in a Lutheran congregation that was black in Springfield, Illinois for a long, long time. Shortly, I don't know his ages exactly and all that, but he realized how deeply racism was built into our society, our culture, and how deeply it permeated not only the South, but the North. And he formed what was called the Lutheran Human Relations Association of America. And this was a brave thing, because the Ku Klux Klan was strong in Indiana. It was strong in many northern places. It was strong near here. And yet he realized that the feast and the wisdom that is part of that feast tells us to build a society in which everybody is welcome, to tell people to come to the table and enjoy the bounty of this creation, and not only that, show love and concern, especially for those who need it. And Andrew Schultze is someone who just so embodied it, and quite frankly, educated a lot of Lutherans. Many Lutherans, like many evangelical Catholics, had the idea that Christianity is basically about one's personal salvation. Do you agree that a lot of people just concentrate on that and forget so much about what Jesus was about, and reaching out to people, and showing love and compassion, and showing that we have to share our joy in creation and the gifts and the bounties that have come to us to make this a better place. And one of the places really to start is to deal with issues of those who are different from us. And we have an inclination, kind of basic inclination, to shun away from those who are different from us, who try to make us think that, well, they're not quite as good, they're not quite as saved, they're not quite as loved. But anyway, this congregation, I'm proud to say, is far beyond many other congregations on recognizing that Christianity is not only about one's personal guilt and all of that for how one lives through eternity. It's about what we do here and now to show love and compassion all around us, even in the far north. And I grew up largely in the Oakland-Berkeley area, but I went to Indiana for a Lutheran college that was training ministers in a strange place called Fort Wayne. While there, I wound up being a leader in some civil rights demonstrations. And this was a time when people like Ross Barnett and George Wallace were spreading their poison. And anyway, I had Berkeley and Oakland blood in me, and I couldn't be quiet. Anyway, I didn't think all that much of it. We had a good demonstration. It involved about 40 students who were training for the Lutheran ministry, and about 30 Roman Catholic seminarians. This was an unusual thing to do back in 1964 or 63. And anyway, we had this demonstration, it hit the papers, it was on TV, and some of us went to have a beer that evening. And when we went to get that beer, we didn't think much about what had happened earlier in the day. It just seemed a successful event, and let's just relax and have a beer or two. Well, it turned out the evening news came on. The first person interviewed was me. And people in the bar instantly recognized that guy up there, that outside agitator, is right here. And let's educate him, or let's say what he should learn. And anyway, we instantly realized it was getting a little strange in there. And people were signaling to the bartender, and we didn't know what was going on, but we knew things were going strange. And and he was reaching for something underneath the cash register. And we thought it might be a weapon. We didn't know. I was 21, 22, and you don't think about that kind of stuff. Well, it turned out it was a photograph, an 8x10 glossy of a lynching. And that lynching had taken place not in the Deep South, where we think of lynchings as having taken place largely, but 8 miles from Fort Wayne, a place called Marion in Indiana. And I'm afraid to say that is the go-to photograph. If anybody is writing an article about lynching and want to have a photograph, it's very ugly. A bunch of white people partying underneath a black man hanging from a tree. And they passed it to me and said, "What do you think of it?" And I said, "That's the most obscene thing I've ever seen." There was a long, long silence. I don't know how long. But somebody cracked a joke or made a comment, and we figured it was not time to talk about singing Kumbaya. And we just got out of there as quickly as we could. But that reminded me in ways that were really dramatic. It was like a scene from a movie. That if you really follow what Jesus asked us to do, you're willing to take risks. And those risks are powerful, and those risks are important, and they're important because of the feast that we have been invited to. A feast of joy, a feast of acceptance, a feast of grace, and a feast of mercy. Let us rejoice and be glad in that. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Did you have the impression, Pastor Robert, that he was proud of that photo?
Oh, yes. And they were probably trying to give us a good scare. Oh, I still have the mic somewhere.
So it was a form of intimidation.
Oh, yeah, and we weren't gonna stay any longer to see what they had in mind. But anyway, there's some saints who recognize that fighting for justice and fighting for dignity of all people is at the heart of our faith.
Amen.
Yes.
Okay, so